to describe the spiritual battle that we see ourselves engaged in. And it's the image of the two standards. Now, this is a military image, right? Armies back then, they would come together and they would have what was called a standard bearer, which is basically the guy who held the banner, which showed which nation or which person this army is fighting for. So you have the standard bearer, and in theology we say that there are only two standards. You are either under the standard of Christ, or you are under the standard of Satan. There is no neutral army, there's no in-between. Every single person is either fighting under the standard of Satan or under the standard of Christ. And of course, the way that it really works out in real life is that, there are times where we're fighting under the standard of Satan, sometimes we're fighting under the standard of Christ. And the goal is to, put ourselves firmly under the standard of Christ. Another way to put this is we can either do things the way that the world says we should do things, or we should do things the way that God tells us to do things. And this has really been the way it has been since the original sin, since Adam and Eve in the garden. We see St. Paul talking about this in our second reading, right? He talks about Adam and then the second Adam, which is Jesus. You see that dichotomy there as well, where he's talking about those who are earthly, and those who are heavenly, and they bear the image of God in that. So I think a story that really nails this thought home is our first reading. And it's the story of David, and we're kind of dropped in the middle of it. And at this point, David is being hunted down. Saul is trying to kill David. Saul is jealous of David. He sees that David is rising up in influence. People are starting to follow David, right? They're singing songs about David's military victories, and they're saying that Saul has slain his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. And Saul is jealous, and so he's trying to kill David, and David's on the run. And in this moment, David finds himself in Saul's camp, and everybody in Saul's camp is asleep, which means somebody screwed up, right? Somebody's supposed to be watching and staying awake, and that person is asleep. And so they're right there. His enemy is right there, right? It even says his spear is right by Saul's head. And so David's right-hand man, Abishai, he says, hey, I'll take his spear, and I only need one thrust. I only need to, boom, just do it once, and he's gone. Your problems are over. And could you blame him if David said, yes, do it? Could you blame him? Right? This man, Saul, is trying to kill him. He's got an army out there hunting him down. He's been on the run for months now. And his problems could be over just like that. And he'd probably be made king fairly quickly afterwards. Could you blame him for doing that? But David, he sees things differently. He sees things differently because he has a radical trust in God. Right? In the story of the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve, right, the reason they sinned was because they lost trust in God. There was a distrust of God. The serpent came in and said, did God really say? Did God really say? And he implanted doubt in their minds. And so Adam and Eve, they distrusted God. And in their distrust, they didn't let God pour out his blessings and continue to give everything to them like he wanted to, but instead they reached out and they took for themselves. And they took the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So they distrusted God and they took for themselves. David, on the other hand, he had a radical trust in God. And he didn't take for himself. If he would have slain Saul right there, that would have been him taking for himself. He's like, yep, I'm going to do it myself. Boom, my problems are over. But he didn't. He had a radical trust in God, and he allowed God to do the work. And in fact, he even goes further and he says, who am I to kill God's anointed? Who am I to kill God's anointed? Keep that in mind. We're going to come back to that later. Do we have that kind of radical trust in God? Where, if we just do this one thing, a lot of our problems would be over, but it's not what God is asking us to do in that moment. Do we have that kind of radical trust to say, you know what, I'm not going to do that thing. I'm going to let God deal with this situation in the way he wants to deal with it. It's pretty radical. It's pretty difficult. Now let's move to our gospel, where Jesus takes this concept and he goes even deeper with it. He goes even deeper. Now, our gospel today, it's oftentimes we can read that and say, oh, this is a bunch of nice sayings, right? Maybe we even have some of these sayings on our wall, right? Do unto others as they would have you do, as you would have them do unto you, right? A bunch of nice sayings and platitudes. Or is it more than that? Jesus is really laying down some hard truth here. He is laying down some hard truth in this gospel today. Starting with, love your enemies. Love your enemies. Now let's take a moment and think about it. Who are your enemies? Right? Who are the people that have hurt you, wounded you in the past? Maybe there are people who want to hurt you intentionally. Maybe there are people who are out to get you, kind of like Saul was out to get David. Maybe not like your life, but maybe they're out to gossip about you. They're out to spread rumors about you. They're out to do you damage of some kind. Think about those people, because we all have them, right? All of us wound other people, and we're wounded by other people. We're all sinful people. There's always those people in our lives. So what are we supposed to do with that? Love your enemies. Well, I think the first thing we need to remember is that those people that you have in mind right now, all of those people you have in mind, none of them are your enemies. They're not. They're not your enemies. We don't have human enemies. Our enemies are spiritual, but they're not human. And why is that? Because every single human was made loved by God, for love for God, and made with the image of God. Every single human is made in the image and likeness of God, and God wants to bring every single one of us to himself. And so they can't be our enemies because they're not God's enemies. They're not our enemies because they're not God's enemies, right? Think about, we're going back to David again, right? He calls Saul the anointed one. Who am I to kill God's anointed? And certainly he's referencing that Saul was anointed the king, right? But I think he's saying more than that too. He was anointed and given by his very creation the image of God. And so David goes, it's not right for me to kill him. It's not right for me to kill someone who bears the image of God. I'm going to let God deal with him, not myself. We love our enemies because through sin, all of us here, every single one of us here, through our own sin, we have made ourselves enemies of God. We have set ourselves in opposition to God because we flat out reject him every time we sin. We say, no, God, I'm not going to do it your way. I want to do it my way. I'm going to reach out for myself and grab what I want for myself. And oftentimes it's from a distrust in God, just like Adam and Eve in the garden. That radical trust is what's required to say, nope, I'm going to trust in you. These are not my enemies. My enemies are spiritual, not human. But through our own sin, we become enemies of God. And God did not leave us as enemies. He did not leave us to just die as enemies, but he himself sent his son to die for us so that we could be called friends of God, so that we could be called sons and daughters of God. It is the mercy that we have been given from our own sinfulness, that mercy that we have received that we don't deserve. That's the mercy that should flow out into the world. That's the mercy that should be given to our enemies, to those who would do us harm. Because we have been shown mercy, we should also go out and show mercy. There are two standards, the standard of Christ and the standard of Satan. And only one of them includes mercy and love. And so, under whose standard will you fight?